The air was heavy with the scent of rain-soaked earth when Elijah Carter stood at the edge of his family's land for what felt like the 1,000th time. 1,500 acres stretched before him, rolling hills, dense pine forests, and the fields where his great-grandfather had once planted rows of corn under a burning southern sun. This wasn't just land. It was memory, legacy, and survival. Every fence post, every tree, every patch of soil carried the fingerprints of generations who had lived, worked, and bled here. The Carters had owned this land for over a century, passed down from Elijah's great-grandfather, who had acquired it after emancipation. It had been rare then, almost unheard of for a black man to hold so much property in a region that still whispered the language of chains. But Elijah's great-grandfather was stubborn, a man who refused to bow to the tides of prejudice. He fought tooth and nail to keep it, even when white land agents tried to cheat him, even when neighbors resented the sight of a black family thriving on such fertile ground. For generations, the land had been their anchor. Elijah's parents raised him with the belief that no matter what the world took from you, if you still had your land, you still had your dignity. And Elijah had believed it until the day he learned that belief could be stolen without warning. It began quietly. A letter from the Homeowners Association, an HOA that hadn't even existed until a nearby development decided to expand its jurisdiction. Elijah had ignored it at first. After all, his land wasn't part of any subdivision, and certainly not subject to their rules. But over the months, more letters came, each one growing bolder. They claimed he owed community fees for road maintenance, drainage upkeep, and neighborhood amenities he had never used. The amounts were small at first, almost laughable, but Elijah's refusal to pay was met with increasing hostility. Then came the notice that would change everything. The HOA had placed a lien on his property. Elijah's first thought was that it was a mistake, a bad joke or clerical error. But when he went to the county office, the truth hit like a sledgehammer. The lien had been filed, the fees inflated with late penalties, and when Elijah refused to acknowledge a debt he didn't owe, the HOA's lawyers had moved to foreclose. By the time he understood the scale of their plan, it was too late. One cold morning, without his consent, without so much as a face-to-face conversation, the land that had been in his family for 104 years was auctioned off for a fraction of its value. 1,500 acres worth millions sold for less than the price of a modest house in the city. The buyers were friends of the HOA board members. Elijah didn't need to guess what had happened. He could see the corruption laid bare. For days, Elijah couldn't bring himself to drive past the property. The thought of strangers walking the trails he had hunted on as a boy, tearing down the barns his father had built, made his chest ache. The community, what was left of it, whispered about it in church, parking lots, and at the barbershop. Some shook their heads in sympathy. Others muttered that he should have just paid the fees to avoid trouble. But Elijah knew better. Paying would have meant surrendering to a lie. Grief has a way of sharpening into something harder, something hotter. For Elijah, that something was resolve. He spent weeks poring over legal documents, tracing every move the HOA had made. He learned their bylaws inside out, combed through county property records, and discovered loopholes the board had either overlooked or arrogantly assumed no one would ever use against them. The deeper he dug, the more he realized that this wasn't just about his land. The HOA had been quietly targeting older residents, especially black families who had lived on their properties for decades. They'd pressure them with bogus fees, bury them in legal threats, and when the families couldn't keep up, they'd seize their homes and sell them to developers. It was theft wearing the mask of legality. Elijah knew the system wasn't built to protect men like him, but he also knew that when the law was twisted, it could sometimes be untwisted if you were patient enough, smart enough, and willing to fight harder than your enemy expected. And Elijah was willing. He started with something small. The HOA's charter contained a clause, buried in the fine print, that required unanimous board approval for certain property decisions. A few of their recent sales hadn't met that requirement. That alone opened the door to lawsuits. But Elijah's real plan was bolder. He discovered that many of the board members' own homes were technically standing on parcels with incomplete title histories. The oversight was small enough that most buyers would never notice, but large enough that, under state law, anyone who could legally acquire those titles could force a sale. Elijah's hands didn't tremble the day he made his first purchase. A quiet transaction with a previous lien holder gave him the controlling interest in a half-acre plot right in the heart of the HOA president's backyard. It wasn't much land, but it was leverage. Word spread slowly at first. People noticed Elijah attending HOA meetings again, sitting in the back with a calm, unreadable expression. They noticed the way the board members' voices tightened when he asked questions on record. They noticed that the man they'd once dismissed as just another stubborn landowner now spoke the language of deeds, covenants, and statutory rights with the precision of a lawyer. Within a year, Elijah had done what no one thought possible. He had acquired controlling interests in multiple parcels across the HOA's jurisdiction, including the land beneath several of the board members' own homes. He hadn't broken a single law. He hadn't made a single threat. He had simply used the same rules they had used against him, only this time, the rules worked in his favor. The first eviction notice sent shockwaves through the community. It wasn't Elijah's goal to see families homeless. He targeted only the board members and their allies, the ones who had voted to strip him of his inheritance. But the message was clear. The days of preying on the powerless were over. Some called him ruthless. Others called him a hero. Elijah didn't care what they called him. For the first time since that cold morning when he'd lost everything, he could breathe without the weight of helplessness crushing his chest. Still, there was one thing left undone. The land, the 1,500 acres, was still gone. But Elijah had learned that justice wasn't always about reclaiming what was lost. Sometimes, it was about making sure those who had taken it never slept comfortably again. The night before the HOA president's final court-ordered move-out date, Elijah drove to the edge of his old property. The moon cast silver light across the fields, and for a moment he could almost hear his father's voice, telling him to stand tall, to never let anyone take what was his without a fight. Elijah smiled, not with joy, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had turned the system on itself. In the stillness, he made a silent promise. If they could take from him without shame, then he would take back, legally, relentlessly, until there was nothing left for them to hide behind. Elijah knew that what he was doing wasn't simply revenge, it was a reckoning. Every move he made was calculated, deliberate, and grounded in the law. That was the point. He wanted his enemies to feel the same cold inevitability he had felt when the county auctioned his family's land. But behind the precision there was a deeper layer of emotion. He remembered the humiliation of standing in court while HOA lawyers smiled like they'd already won. He remembered the way they avoided his eyes as if he were invisible. That memory kept his resolve sharp. The HOA board fought back, of course. They filed countersuits, tried to challenge his acquisitions, and even attempted to smear his name in the local paper. They called him vindictive, unstable, and a danger to community harmony. But the more they attacked, the more Elijah's reputation grew among those who had been quietly suffering under the HOA's abuses. Older black homeowners began to show up at court hearings just to watch him work. They whispered his name in grocery store aisles and thanked him in hushed tones after Sunday service. Elijah didn't just buy parcels to evict the guilty. He also used his leverage to negotiate restitution for those who had been wronged. In some cases, he forced the HOA to pay back families they had illegally fined or foreclosed on. In others, he transferred ownership of certain parcels to community trusts so they could never again be seized by predatory tactics. One of the most satisfying victories came when he uncovered an illegal assessment scheme the HOA had been running for years. They had charged residents thousands for community upgrades that were never completed. Using that evidence, Elijah persuaded a judge to freeze the HOA's operating accounts pending investigation. Overnight, their financial power evaporated. The board members who had strutted through meetings with smug confidence were suddenly scrambling to pay their own legal bills. Still, the crown jewel of his campaign was the president's home. That man, Donald Pierce, had been the face of Elijah's humiliation from day one. Pierce had been the one to sign the foreclosure papers on the Carter land. He had been the one to smirk across the courtroom when the sale was finalized. Elijah made sure Pierce's eviction was a public event. On the morning the movers arrived, the street was lined with neighbors. Some came to watch, others to gloat, and a few simply to bear witness. Elijah stood across the road, hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable. Pierce avoided looking at him, barking orders to the movers. But Elijah didn't need his acknowledgement. The sight of the man's furniture being hauled out in the open sunlight was acknowledgement enough. When the moving truck pulled away, Elijah walked up the driveway, not as a trespasser but as the legal owner. He stepped onto the porch and looked out at the neighborhood. For the first time he felt the balance tip. But winning battles did not erase the war scars. At night, when the adrenaline faded, Elijah sometimes wondered if he had lost more than land. He had spent years consumed by strategy, paperwork, and court hearings. Friendships had strained under the weight of his mission. Family dinners had turned into brief check-ins between deadlines. Justice had its price, and Elijah had paid in time, peace, and pieces of himself. Yet deep down, he knew the alternative would have been worse, living, with the knowledge that they had taken everything without resistance. Months passed, and the HOA's structure collapsed under its own corruption. Without funds, without leadership, and under state investigation, the organization dissolved. The remaining residents voted to replace it with a cooperative model that gave homeowners real power and protection. Elijah didn't run for any position. He had no interest in governing. His role had been to dismantle, not to rebuild, but he stayed close enough to ensure no one repeated the mistakes of the past. Then came the day he least expected. A local journalist who had covered Elijah's fight from the beginning called him with news. The buyer who had acquired his family's 500 acres was now facing foreclosure of their own, unrelated to Elijah's actions. Years of mismanagement and unpaid taxes had caught up to them. The land was headed back to auction. Elijah's first reaction was disbelief. Then came the flood of memories. The smell of his father's tobacco pipe on the porch, the feel of warm dirt between his toes as a boy, the sound of cicadas on summer nights. He didn't hesitate. This time he came prepared. With funds from his property sales and the quiet support of community members he had helped, Elijah entered the auction with confidence. He bid once, twice, 3 times, and when the gavel fell, the land was his again. The news spread like wildfire. People called it a miracle, a twist of fate, divine justice. But Elijah knew it was more than that. It was the culmination of every sleepless night, every legal maneuver, every moment he had refused to bow. When he drove back onto the property, he stopped at the same spot where he had stood on that rainy morning years before. The fields were overgrown, the fences weathered, but the soul of the land was unchanged. It welcomed him back like an old friend. He didn't rebuild it alone. Neighbors came to help clear brush. Elders told stories of his great-grandfather, reminding the younger generation of the power of ownership and resilience. Together they planted new crops, repaired old barns, and restored the farmhouse. Elijah made a promise to protect the land, not just for himself, but for the community that had stood by him. In the years that followed, the Carter property became more than a farm. It became a symbol. Schools brought students to learn about its history. Families held reunions under its oak trees. And in the middle of it all stood Elijah, not as a man defined by what had been taken from him, but by what he had taken back. He never forgot the long road to justice. He never forgot the faces of those who tried to strip him of his dignity, and he never forgot the quiet truth that had carried him through the darkest moments. The system is only unbeatable if you play by the rules they write. Sometimes to win, you have to write your own, without ever breaking the law. One autumn evening, Elijah sat on the porch of the restored farmhouse, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The fields shimmered gold, the air was alive with the hum of crickets, and the land, their land, was at peace. It had been more than a victory. It was a restoration of dignity, a testament to the unshakable will of a man who refused to be erased. And for every black family who had ever been told they didn't belong, Elijah's story stood as proof. They did belong, and no one had the right to take that away.